At my niece's birthday party, my 3-year-old daughter excitedly called out, "I want some cake too." My sister-in-law screamed, "Control your bratty kid." When my daughter kept asking, she threw the entire cake at her face, making her fall and hit her head on the table. Blood started pooling as she lost consciousness. My mother-in-law shouted, "Just pick her up, we can't have drama at my precious granddaughter's party." I didn't argue. I called 911, and when they gave me the medical report, I made sure to ruin my in-laws completely. Now, I'm Amanda, and this is the story of how one horrific moment changed everything. Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's served with a side of justice that's been a long time coming. It was supposed to be a simple birthday party. My niece Ava was turning 5, and my sister-in-law Melissa had been planning this perfect celebration for weeks. Melissa always had to make everything about appearances, the Pinterest-worthy decorations, the elaborate 3-tier cake from the most expensive bakery in town, the coordinated party favors that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. My husband Ryan and I arrived with our 4-year-old daughter Chloe, who was practically bouncing with excitement. She'd been talking about Ava's party for days, asking if there would be cake and if she could play with the other kids. Chloe was always such a sweet, well-behaved child, curious and enthusiastic, but never demanding or disruptive. The party was in full swing when we arrived at my mother-in-law Eleanor's house. The backyard was transformed into what looked like a fairy tale scene, complete with balloon arches and a candy buffet. Eleanor had spared no expense, as usual. She'd always favored Melissa's children over mine, making it clear that Ava and her younger brother Tyler were the real grandchildren, while Chloe was somehow less important because she wasn't Melissa's child. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. Chloe played nicely with the other kids, sharing toys and following all the party games. She was having the time of her life, her little face glowing with joy as she participated in the treasure hunt and musical chairs. Then came time for the cake. Melissa had everyone gather around as she prepared to cut the magnificent creation she'd been photographing from every angle. The cake was a work of art, 3 tiers covered in fondant roses and edible glitter, with Ava's name written in elaborate script across the top. All the children were seated at the little tables, their eyes wide with anticipation. Chloe was sitting at the far end of one table, patiently waiting her turn like all the other kids. As Melissa began cutting the cake and serving the birthday girl first, Chloe raised her small hand and called out in her sweet little voice, "I want some cake too." It was such an innocent, normal thing for a 4-year-old to say. She wasn't demanding or rude, just excited and expressing what every child at the party was thinking. But Melissa's reaction was immediate and vicious. "Control your bratty kid," she screamed across the yard, her face contorting with rage. "This isn't about her. She needs to learn some manners." I was shocked. "Melissa, she's just excited. She's 4 years old and, I don't care how old she is," Melissa continued, her voice getting louder. "She's being disruptive and ruining Ava's special day." Ryan stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Come on, Jess, she's just a little kid asking for cake like everyone else." But Melissa was beyond reason. Her face was red with fury, and I could see the other parents starting to look uncomfortable. Some were pulling their own children closer, sensing the tension in the air. Chloe, confused by the shouting, looked around nervously and then asked again, her voice smaller this time, "Can I please have some cake?" That's when Melissa snapped completely. I said no. She shrieked, and before anyone could react, she picked up the entire bottom tier of the cake, this massive, heavy piece that must have weighed several pounds, and hurled it directly at my 4-year-old daughter. The cake hit Chloe square in the face with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that it knocked her backward off her chair. She fell hard, her little head striking the corner of the wooden picnic table with a sickening thud that I'll never forget. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I saw the blood. It started as a small trickle from behind Chloe's ear, but within seconds it was spreading across the concrete patio beneath her head. My baby wasn't moving. She wasn't crying. She was just lying there, completely still, her little body crumpled in an unnatural position. "Chloe!" I screamed, rushing to her side. I dropped to my knees beside her, afraid to move her but desperate to help. "Baby, wake up. Chloe, please." The blood was pooling now, bright red against the gray concrete. Her eyes were closed, and she was so pale. I pressed my ear to her chest and could barely hear her shallow breathing. I looked up at Melissa, expecting some kind of remorse, some recognition of the horror of what she'd just done. Instead, she was standing there with her arms crossed, looking annoyed. "She shouldn't have been so demanding," Melissa said coldly. "Maybe now she'll learn to behave properly at parties." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My daughter was unconscious and bleeding, and Melissa was acting like it was Chloe's fault. But then my mother-in-law Eleanor spoke up, and her words cut even deeper. "Just pick her up, Amanda," she said dismissively, waving her hand like she was shooing away a fly. We can't have this kind of drama at my precious granddaughter's party. You're making a scene. I stared at her in disbelief. Eleanor, she's unconscious. There's blood everywhere. Children fall down all the time, Eleanor replied with a shrug. She'll be fine. But you're ruining Ava's special day with all this fuss. The other parents were watching in horror, but no one said anything. They were all too shocked by what they'd witnessed. Several of them were quietly gathering their own children and leaving. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to defend our daughter, to say something to his family about their appalling behavior. But Ryan just stood there, looking torn between his loyalty to his family and his concern for Chloe. Ryan, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Call 911. Now. Amanda, maybe we should just take her to urgent care, he said uncertainly. I mean, she's probably just. She's unconscious, I shouted. There's blood pouring from her head. I'm calling 911 right now. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed. When the dispatcher answered, I could barely get the words out through my tears. My daughter. She's 4 years old. Someone threw a cake at her and she hit her head. There's so much blood. She won't wake up. The dispatcher was calm and professional, walking me through the steps to check Chloe's breathing and pulse while keeping her still. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and I watched as the paramedics worked over my little girl. Possible traumatic brain injury, I heard one of them say into his radio. We need to get her to the trauma center immediately. As they loaded Chloe into the ambulance, I turned to look at my in-laws one more time. Melissa was already cutting a new cake, trying to salvage Ava's party as if nothing had happened. Eleanor was helping her, chatting with a few remaining guests about how some people just can't control their children. Neither of them even looked in my direction as the ambulance drove away with my unconscious daughter inside. The next several days were the longest of my life. Chloe had suffered a severe concussion and a hairline skull fracture. The doctors told me that while the injury was serious, she had been fortunate, a few more inches to the left and the impact could have been fatal. She would need careful monitoring and therapy, but with time, most children recovered well from this type of injury. I sat by her hospital bed, holding her tiny hand and watching the monitors that tracked her vital signs. She looked so small and fragile surrounded by all those machines. The bandages around her head were a stark reminder of the violence that had been done to her. Ryan finally showed up the next morning, bringing coffee and looking sheepish. How is she? He asked quietly. She's alive, I said without looking at him. No thanks to your family. Amanda, I know you're upset, but, upset? I turned to face him, and he actually stepped back from the fury he saw in my eyes. Ryan, your sister threw a cake at our 3-year-old daughter's head. She could have killed her. And your mother acted like it was Chloe's fault for existing. Melissa didn't mean for this to happen, he said weakly. She was just stressed about the party, and, don't you dare make excuses for her, I interrupted. She deliberately hurt our child. And you stood there and let it happen. Ryan ran his hands through his hair. What do you want me to do, Amanda? They're my family. So are we, I said quietly. Or we're supposed to be. That's when I knew that whatever happened next, I was going to be facing it alone. My husband was going to choose his family over his daughter, just like he always had. The medical bills started arriving within a week. Chloe's hospitalization and initial treatment cost over $45,000. The ongoing therapy sessions, the medications, the follow-up appointments, it was adding up to tens of thousands of dollars. Our insurance covered most of it, but we were still looking at substantial out-of-pocket expenses. I called Melissa to ask if she would help with the medical expenses, since her actions had caused them. Her response was exactly what I expected. I'm not paying for anything, she said flatly. Chloe shouldn't have been bothering me about cake. If you can't afford medical bills, maybe you shouldn't have had a kid. I asked Eleanor the same question, and her answer was even worse. Melissa is going through a divorce right now, she said. She can't afford to throw money around on every little accident. Besides, children are resilient. Chloe will bounce back. That's when I decided they were both going to pay. Not just financially, but in every way possible. I started by documenting everything. I took photos of Chloe's injuries, saved all the medical records, and wrote down every detail I could remember about the incident. I reached out to the other parents who had been at the party and asked them to write statements about what they'd witnessed. Most of them were happy to help. They'd been horrified by what they'd seen and wanted to make sure Chloe got justice. Then I called a lawyer. David Martinez specialized in personal injury cases involving children, and when I told him what had happened, he was immediately interested. He reviewed all my documentation and interviewed the witnesses, and within a week he told me we had an incredibly strong case. This wasn't an accident, he explained. Your sister-in-law deliberately threw a heavy object at a 3-year-old child with enough force to cause severe injury. That's assault, and it's also criminal endangerment of a minor. We filed both civil and criminal charges. The criminal case was handled by the district attorney's office, while David pursued the civil case for damages. But I wasn't done yet. I knew that both Melissa and Eleanor worked in fields where their reputations mattered. Melissa was a real estate agent with a high-end firm, and Eleanor was a vice principal at the local elementary school. I made sure that their employers learned about what had happened. I sent copies of the police report and witness statements to Melissa's real estate company, along with a letter explaining how one of their agents had violently assaulted a toddler at a family gathering. I also sent everything to the local real estate board, since Melissa's license could be revoked for criminal behavior. For Eleanor, I contacted the school district's administration and the state education department. I pointed out that someone who thought it was acceptable to dismiss violence against children probably shouldn't be working in an elementary school. While I was building my case, I also started investigating Melissa and Eleanor more thoroughly. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of people I was dealing with, and what I discovered only strengthened my resolve. Melissa, it turned out, had a history of volatile behavior that her family had been covering up for years. I reached out to her ex-husband, Tom, who was more than willing to share his experiences. He told me about the restraining order he'd had to file during their divorce proceedings after she'd thrown a vase at him during an argument. He showed me photos of the bruises on his arms where she'd grabbed him, and text messages where she'd threatened to make him pay for leaving her. Melissa has serious anger management issues, Tom explained to me over coffee one afternoon. She can't handle any situation where she's not in complete control. The scary part is how quickly she can flip from charming to violent. One minute she's the perfect hostess, the next she's throwing things and screaming. He also told me about incidents with their children, how Melissa would explode over minor infractions, once making their 8-year-old son stand in the corner for 3 hours because he'd accidentally spilled juice on her white carpet. The divorce records showed that Tom had been granted primary custody largely due to concerns about Melissa's temper and what the court psychologist had termed concerning patterns of emotional volatility. I tried to warn Ryan about her behavior around Chloe, Tom continued. I could see how Melissa looked at your daughter, like she was an inconvenience, something that took attention away from her own kids. But Ryan always made excuses for her. This information was gold for our legal case. David immediately subpoenaed Melissa's divorce records and the restraining order documents. The pattern of violence wasn't isolated to what happened to Chloe, it was part of a larger behavioral issue that made Melissa a danger to children. Eleanor's background was equally revealing. I spent hours going through old school board meeting minutes and talking to current and former teachers at her school. What I found painted a picture of someone who ruled through intimidation and favoritism. Several teachers told me, off the record, about Eleanor's treatment of students she deemed problematic. There was the case of Marcus, a 7-year-old with ADHD, whom Eleanor had made sit alone in the hallway for an entire week because he was disruptive in class. When his parents complained, she told them they should consider homeschooling if they couldn't handle the consequences of their son's behavior. Then there was the incident with Sophia, a 3rd grader whose family had recently immigrated from Mexico. Sophia was still learning English and sometimes struggled to understand instructions. Instead of providing additional support, Eleanor had recommended that the child be held back a grade, telling the parents that some children just aren't cut out for academic success. The most damning story came from Janet, a kindergarten teacher who'd worked under Eleanor for 5 years before transferring to another school. Eleanor had no business working with children, Janet told me during a phone conversation. She saw kids as problems to be managed, not people to be nurtured. She played favorites constantly, the kids from wealthy families got special treatment, while children from working-class homes were treated like burdens. Janet described how Eleanor would make dismissive comments about children who came to school in worn clothes or with free lunch cards. She'd refer to them as those kids and seemed to take pleasure in finding reasons to suspend or discipline them. The final straw for me was when she refused to allow a 4th grader to call his grandmother after he got sick at school, Janet continued. The boy's parents both worked double shifts, and his grandmother was his emergency contact. But Eleanor said she didn't have time to deal with family drama and made him sit in the nurse's office for 4 hours until his parents could leave work. Armed with this information, I reached out to more families who'd had negative experiences with Eleanor. I found 12 parents willing to provide statements about her inappropriate treatment of their children. Some of the stories were heartbreaking, children coming home in tears because the vice principal had humiliated them in front of their classmates, parents being told their kids were unteachable when they simply needed additional support. David was thrilled with this additional evidence. This shows a clear pattern of disregard for child welfare, he explained. Eleanor's reaction to your daughter's injury wasn't an aberration, it was consistent with her fundamental lack of empathy for children. Meanwhile, Chloe's recovery was proving more complicated than we'd initially hoped. The neurologist explained that traumatic brain injuries in young children often revealed their full impact over time, as the child's development progressed and new challenges emerged. "We're seeing some concerning signs," Dr. Rodriguez told me during one of our regular follow-up appointments. "Chloe's short-term memory has been affected, and she's showing signs of difficulty with executive function, things like planning, organization, and impulse control." The speech therapist had similar concerns. Chloe was struggling to find words sometimes, and her ability to follow multi-step instructions had been compromised. What had seemed like minor issues immediately after the accident were now clearly symptoms of more significant brain damage. "The good news is that children's brains are rewritably plastic," the speech therapist explained. "With intensive therapy, many of these issues can improve significantly. But it's going to be a long process, possibly years." Each new challenge Chloe faced only fueled my determination to make Melissa and Eleanor pay for what they'd done. This wasn't just about the immediate trauma, they had potentially affected my daughter's entire future, her ability to learn and succeed in school, her confidence and self-esteem. The therapy sessions were heartbreaking to watch. Chloe would get frustrated when she couldn't remember simple instructions or when words wouldn't come to her. She'd ask me why she couldn't think as well as she used to, why some things that used to be easy were now so hard. "Did I do something wrong, Mommy?" she asked me one day after a particularly difficult occupational therapy session. "Is that why my brain got hurt?" I had to leave the room to compose myself. The idea that my sweet, innocent daughter might blame herself for what Melissa had done to her was almost unbearable. The financial strain was becoming overwhelming as well. Even with insurance, we were facing thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket expenses every month. I'd had to take extended leave from my job to manage Chloe's care, which meant we'd lost a significant portion of our income right when our expenses were skyrocketing. I applied for assistance through various programs, but the bureaucracy was nightmare. Forms had to be filled out in triplicate, medical records had to be submitted and resubmitted, and every request seemed to require 3 different signatures from specialists, who were booked solid for months. Meanwhile, Melissa was posting on social media about her vacation to Cabo with her new boyfriend, apparently unbothered by the fact that her actions had left a 3-year-old with permanent brain damage. The photos showed her lounging by the pool, cocktail in hand, with captions about living her best life and not letting negative people bring her down. Eleanor was no better. She'd started a blog called Wisdom from Experience where she wrote sanctimonious posts about entitled parents who expected schools to accommodate every whim of their special snowflake children. The irony of someone who'd dismissed a child's traumatic brain injury writing about parental entitlement was sickening. That's when I decided to expand my campaign beyond just the legal proceedings. I created a detailed timeline of events and shared it on every local Facebook group and community forum I could find. I included photos of Chloe's injuries, with her face obscured for privacy, copies of the medical reports, and statements from witnesses. I made sure everyone in our community knew exactly what Melissa and Eleanor had done and how they'd responded afterward. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents were horrified by what they read, and many shared their own negative experiences with both women. The post was shared hundreds of times, reaching far beyond our immediate community. Local businesses started distancing themselves from Melissa and Eleanor. The country club where Eleanor had been a member for 15 years quietly asked her to resign. The boutique where Melissa shopped regularly told her she was no longer welcome after other customers complained about her presence. I also reached out to professional organizations and licensing boards. Melissa's real estate license was up for renewal, and I made sure the licensing board was aware of her criminal charges and pattern of violent behavior. For Eleanor, I contacted the state education department and provided documentation of her inappropriate treatment of students over the years. The media attention intensified when a local reporter, Maria Santos, decided to do an in-depth investigation into the case. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed court documents, and spoke with other families who'd had negative experiences with Eleanor in her role as vice principal. The resulting series of articles painted a devastating picture of both women. The headlines were brutal: local real estate agent charged with assaulting toddler. Vice principal's history of dismissing student concerns, and family seeks justice after child's life-threatening injuries. Maria's investigation uncovered even more troubling information. She found that Eleanor had been reprimanded by the school district twice in the past 5 years for inappropriate interactions with students and parents, but the disciplinary actions had been kept confidential. The school board, facing public pressure, eventually released a statement acknowledging concerning patterns of behavior and promising a thorough review of personnel policies. The most damaging revelation came when Maria obtained audio recordings from school board meetings where Eleanor had made dismissive comments about students with learning disabilities and special needs. In one recording, she could be heard saying that some children are just not capable of keeping up with normal academic standards and suggesting that parents of struggling students should accept reality rather than pushing for accommodations. Parents in the community were outraged. Petitions began circulating demanding Eleanor's immediate termination, and protests were organized outside the school district office. The hashtag #FireEleanor Henderson began trending on local social media. Melissa's situation was deteriorating just as rapidly. Her criminal defense attorney had advised her to keep a low profile, but she seemed incapable of staying out of the spotlight. She gave an interview to a local radio station where she tried to portray herself as the victim, claiming that I was engaged in a vicious campaign of harassment against her family. "All I did was throw a piece of cake," she said during the interview. "Children fall down all the time. This woman is trying to destroy my life over an accident." The interview backfired spectacularly. Listeners called in to express their disgust at Melissa's characterization of the incident as just throwing cake. The radio station received so many complaints that they issued a public apology for giving her a platform to minimize the assault of a child. As the criminal trial approached, I could see the toll the public scrutiny was taking on both Melissa and Eleanor. Melissa had lost significant weight and looked haggard whenever she appeared in court. Eleanor had developed a noticeable shake in her hands and seemed to age years in the span of months. But I felt no sympathy for either of them. Every time I watched Chloe struggle with a task that should have been simple for a child her age, every time she got frustrated because her injured brain couldn't process information the way it used to, I was reminded of why they deserved everything that was happening to them. The week before the trial began, Melissa's attorney approached David with a plea bargain offer. Melissa would plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for probation and community service, but no jail time. David brought the offer to me, but I rejected it immediately. "She nearly killed my daughter," I told him. "She threw a heavy object at a 3-year-old's head with enough force to fracture her skull. Then she showed no remorse whatsoever. I want her to face the full consequences of what she did." The local news picked up the story after someone leaked the police report. The headline read, "Woman throws cake at 3-year-old, causes skull fracture." The story went viral on social media, and suddenly everyone in town knew what Melissa and Eleanor had done. By the time the story reached social media, it had taken on a life of its own. The original Facebook post had been shared over 50,000 times, with comments ranging from outrage to disbelief. Twitter users were calling for boycotts of any business that continued to associate with Melissa or Eleanor. Someone had even created a Change.org petition demanding that both women face the maximum possible legal consequences. The viral nature of the story meant that Melissa and Eleanor's actions were being discussed far beyond our small community. Parenting blogs picked up the story, using it as an example of how adults can fail to protect children. Child safety advocates cited the case in their calls for stronger laws protecting minors from assault. Melissa's real estate company didn't just drop her, they scrubbed all evidence of her existence from their website and Ryanetting materials. Her professional headshots were removed, her bio deleted, and her name struck from their agent directory. It was as if she had never worked there at all. The real estate board's investigation was swift and decisive. They suspended her license immediately and began proceedings for permanent revocation. The board's chairwoman issued a statement saying that individuals who engage in violence against children have no place in the real estate profession, where trust and character are paramount. Eleanor's situation at the school was becoming untenable as well. Parents were pulling their children out of classes rather than risk having them interact with her. Teachers were requesting transfers to other schools to avoid working under her supervision. The school board was facing unprecedented pressure to act decisively. During one particularly heated school board meeting, over 200 parents packed the auditorium to demand Eleanor's termination. One by one, they shared stories of their children's negative experiences with her, instances of humiliation, dismissiveness, and outright cruelty that painted a picture of someone fundamentally unsuited to work with children. "My daughter came home crying every day for a month because Mrs. Henderson told her she was stupid for needing help with math," one mother testified. "She's 7 years old. 7-year-olds need help with math." Another parent described how Eleanor had forced his son to eat lunch alone in the hallway for a week because the boy had been disruptive in class, disruption that turned out to be the child asking questions because he couldn't see the board and needed glasses. The testimonies went on for hours, each one more damning than the last. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Eleanor's position was completely untenable. 3 days later, the school board voted unanimously to terminate her employment, effective immediately. The vote was met with thunderous applause from the packed auditorium. Melissa's real estate company dropped her immediately. They released a statement saying they couldn't have someone associated with child abuse representing their brand. The real estate board suspended her license pending the outcome of the criminal case. Eleanor was placed on administrative leave while the school district conducted their own investigation. Parents were calling for her removal, saying they didn't want someone who condoned violence against children working with their kids. As the criminal case moved forward, I made sure to document every aspect of Chloe's ongoing struggles. I kept a detailed journal of her daily challenges, the moments when she'd forget what she was doing mid-sentence, the times she'd break down in tears because a simple puzzle that used to be easy was now impossible for her to complete. The occupational therapist, Dr. Kim, was helping Chloe relearn skills that had been affected by her injury. Tasks like tying her shoes or cutting with scissors, things she'd been mastering before the accident, now required extra practice and patience. Her coordination had been affected by the brain injury, and watching her work so hard to regain abilities she'd lost was heartbreaking. She's working twice as hard as other children her age just to do normal things, Dr. Kim explained to me after one particularly difficult session. The injury affected the part of her brain responsible for motor planning and coordination. With time and therapy, she'll improve, but she may always have some limitations. I recorded these conversations, knowing they would be crucial for the civil case. Every piece of evidence that showed the long-term impact of Melissa's actions would help ensure that Chloe received the compensation she deserved for a lifetime of challenges. The neuropsychologist's report showed that while Chloe's injury was healing well, there were some areas of concern. Dr. Williams had conducted age-appropriate developmental assessments and found that Chloe was showing some delays in processing speed and attention that hadn't existed before the accident. The good news is that her injury occurred while her brain is still very plastic, Dr. Williams explained during our meeting. Children her age often make rewindable recoveries with proper therapy and support. However, we'll need to monitor her closely as she starts school to ensure she gets any additional help she might need. The report estimated that Chloe would likely need ongoing therapy and potentially some educational support, with costs that could reach $200,000 over the next several years, a significant burden for any family. I made copies of every medical report and therapy note, building a comprehensive file that painted a clear picture of how one moment of violence had forever altered my daughter's life trajectory. Each document was another nail in Melissa's coffin, more evidence of the destruction she'd caused. Meanwhile, I was also building a case against Eleanor for her role in the aftermath. While she hadn't thrown the cake, her response to Chloe's injury was almost equally damaging. I researched legal precedents for bystander liability and failure to render aid in cases involving injured children. David was intrigued by this angle. Eleanor had a legal and moral duty to ensure the safety of children at that party, he explained. Her dismissal of your daughter's obvious medical emergency could constitute negligence, especially given her professional background in education. We found cases where school administrators had been held liable for failing to respond appropriately to student injuries. Eleanor's reaction, telling me to just pick her up while Chloe was unconscious and bleeding, was exactly the kind of response that courts had found unacceptable in similar situations. I also discovered that Eleanor had lied to the police in her initial statement. She claimed that Chloe had just fallen down while playing and minimized the severity of her injuries. The police report showed that Eleanor had told officers Chloe was just crying about a bump on her head when she was actually unconscious with a fractured skull. This discovery led to additional charges against Eleanor for providing false information to law enforcement and obstruction of justice. The prosecutor was building a case that both women had not only caused harm to Chloe but had then actively worked to cover up the severity of what had happened. The investigation also revealed that Melissa had been drinking at the party. Several witnesses mentioned that she'd been consuming wine throughout the afternoon, and one parent specifically remembered her refilling her glass multiple times. A toxicology test hadn't been performed at the scene, but witness statements suggested that Melissa's judgment may have been impaired when she made the decision to throw the cake. This information opened up additional avenues for both criminal and civil liability. Assault charges became more serious when alcohol was involved, and the civil case could now include arguments about reckless endangerment and impaired decision-making. I spent hours each night researching similar cases, looking for precedents and strategies that might help ensure maximum consequences for both women. I read about other parents who'd fought for justice after their children were hurt, and I learned about the various ways that perpetrators tried to minimize their actions or escape accountability. One case that particularly resonated with me involved a daycare worker who'd shaken a toddler, causing brain damage similar to Chloe's. The worker had initially claimed it was an accident, but security footage showed she'd been frustrated with the child's crying and had deliberately shaken him in anger. The similarities to Melissa's case were striking, both involved adults who'd lost control and taken their anger out on defenseless children. The daycare case had resulted in significant criminal penalties and a multi-million-dollar civil judgment. The precedent gave me hope that we could achieve similar results in our case. I also researched Eleanor's employment history more thoroughly and discovered that she'd been named as a defendant in 2 previous lawsuits involving student welfare. Both cases had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements, but I was able to find references to them in court filing databases. One case involved a student who'd been injured on a field trip when Eleanor had allegedly failed to follow proper safety protocols. The other concerned a child with special needs who'd been inappropriately disciplined and humiliated in front of his classmates. The pattern of disregard for child welfare was becoming increasingly clear. David subpoenaed records from both previous cases, arguing that they showed a pattern of negligence that was relevant to our current lawsuit. While the settlement agreements prevented us from seeing the full details, the fact that the school district had paid significant sums to resolve both cases suggested that Eleanor's conduct had been seriously problematic. As word of these previous incidents spread through the community, public opinion against Eleanor hardened even further. Parents began to wonder how many other children had been harmed by her negligence over the years, and how the school district had allowed her to continue working despite these red flags. The school board faced increasing pressure to explain why they'd kept Eleanor in her position despite the previous settlements. Board meetings became contentious affairs, with parents demanding answers about the district's hiring and retention practices. During one particularly heated meeting, the school board president was forced to acknowledge that they'd been aware of some concerns about Eleanor's performance but had believed that additional training and supervision would address the issues. Parents were outraged that their children had been put at risk by the board's decision to give Eleanor multiple chances to improve. The revelation of the previous incidents also attracted the attention of state education officials, who opened their own investigation into the school district's personnel practices. The state education department announced that they would be reviewing all cases involving Eleanor and examining whether the district had followed proper protocols for reporting and addressing concerns about employee conduct. This expanded investigation meant that Eleanor was now facing potential consequences at multiple levels: criminal charges related to Chloe's case, termination from her current position, potential revocation of her teaching credentials, and scrutiny from state officials that could affect her ability to work in education anywhere in the state. The pressure was clearly taking its toll on both women. Melissa had developed a noticeable twitch in her left eye, and she'd lost so much weight that her clothes hung loosely on her frame. She'd been forced to move in with her elderly parents after losing her apartment, since no landlord in town would rent to her once her story became public. Eleanor wasn't faring much better. The stress had exacerbated her high blood pressure, and she'd been hospitalized twice for what doctors described as stress-related cardiac episodes. Her husband, who'd initially stood by her, was reportedly considering divorce as the scandal continued to damage his own reputation in the community. The criminal case took nearly 8 months to work its way through the system. During that time, I watched Melissa's attempts to minimize what she'd done become increasingly desperate. Her initial strategy of claiming it was an accident fell apart when multiple witnesses testified that she deliberately aimed the cake at Chloe's face. During the trial, the prosecutor played a recording of my 911 call. You could hear the panic in my voice as I described my unconscious daughter bleeding on the concrete. Several jurors were crying by the end of it. Melissa's lawyer tried to argue that it was an accident, that she'd only meant to throw the cake near Chloe, not at her. But the witnesses were clear. They'd seen Melissa aim directly at my daughter's face and throw the cake with tremendous force. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both charges. Melissa was sentenced to 4 months in jail, 2 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution for Chloe's medical expenses. Eleanor never faced criminal charges, but the school district fired her after their investigation concluded that her response to the incident showed a fundamental lack of judgment and compassion that makes her unfit to work with children. The civil case took another year to resolve. David argued that Melissa's actions had been so reckless and the consequences so severe that significant damages were warranted. He brought in medical experts who testified about Chloe's ongoing challenges and the costs associated with her continued care and monitoring. The jury awarded us $650,000 in damages. While Melissa had to declare bankruptcy, we were able to collect most of the judgment through garnishment of her future wages and the sale of assets. The money would help ensure that Chloe had access to any additional therapy or educational support she might need as she grew older. But the social consequences were perhaps the worst part for them. In a small town like ours, everyone knew what had happened. Melissa's real estate license was suspended for 2 years rather than permanently revoked, but the conviction made it nearly impossible for her to find work in the field. She eventually moved to another state to rebuild her career. Eleanor lost her teaching credentials and was unable to find work in education anywhere in the state. She eventually moved to a retirement community in Florida, unable to handle the constant judgment and whispers in our small town. Ryan and I divorced 6 months after the incident. He never forgave me for destroying his family, and I never forgave him for not protecting our daughter. He moved in with his mother after Eleanor lost her house, and I rarely see him anymore. Chloe is doing much better now, 2 years later. She still needs some extra support with certain tasks, and we continue with regular checkups to monitor her progress. But she's proven to be incredibly resilient, and she's thriving in kindergarten with the help of a wonderful teacher who understands her needs. We used some of the settlement money to move to a different town, where we could start fresh without the constant reminders of what happened. Chloe has made lots of friends who don't know about her past trauma, and she's just like any other 6-year-old, full of curiosity and joy. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Melissa and Eleanor. They say I went too far, that I ruined their lives over what was essentially a moment of poor judgment. But I don't feel guilty at all. What Melissa did to my daughter wasn't a moment of poor judgment, it was a deliberate act of violence against a defenseless child. And their reaction afterward, dismissing her injuries and refusing to take responsibility, showed exactly who they really were. I think about that day often, and I'm always struck by how quickly everything changed. One moment, Chloe was a happy little girl excited about birthday cake. The next, she was fighting for her life because two adults decided that their convenience was more important than her safety.